It started with a harmless ghost hunting app, a fun little distraction in our supposedly ordinary apartment. But then the voices on the app grew clearer, more direct, and the cold spots began to appear. Not just in the apartment, but right beside my ear. My name is Chloe, and I was a 23-year-old marketing assistant living with my best friend, Maya, in a trendy, converted loft in downtown Los Angeles, California. We were both city girls, pragmatic and a little cynical, always looking for the next experience, but firmly grounded in reality. Our loft was modern, sleek, with exposed brick and high ceilings, a far cry from any haunted mansion. One evening, bored, Maya downloaded a ghost radar app, one of those silly phone applications that supposedly detect electromagnetic fluctuations and translate them into words. We laughed about it, pointing our phones at empty corners, joking about spectral roommates. It was all harmless fun, a silly parlor trick. We were both rational, educated women, not given to flights of fancy or belief in the supernatural. The first hint of something wrong was the app itself. It started picking up words, not random gibberish, but coherent, sometimes unsettling words like watch, dark, or cold. We'd shrug it off as coincidental algorithms, clever programming. But then, the app began to call out Maya's name, then mine, faintly at first, then clearer. We'd laugh nervously, still convinced it was a trick. That's when the cold spots started. Sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature in various parts of the loft, like walking into an invisible cloud of frigid air. They'd last for a few seconds, then dissipate, leaving us shivering and exchanging uneasy glances. We blamed the old building's draftiness, or perhaps a faulty AC unit. But then, one night, as we were both watching TV, the app, which was lying on the coffee table, suddenly blared out a single, clear word: leave. It was a child's voice, high-pitched and urgent. We both stared at the phone, then at each other, a prickle of genuine fear running down our spines. We tried to find a rational explanation, another app interfering, a strange radio frequency, but none of it felt right. The app became a constant, unwelcome companion, routinely calling out our names, sometimes whispering warnings, like alone or behind you. The words were no longer random. They were clearly reacting to our presence, to our conversations. The cold spots intensified, often accompanied by faint, unexplainable smells, sometimes a sweet, cloying lavender, other times a metallic temps like old blood. One morning, Maya found a child's drawing, rendered in faded crayon, tucked under her pillow. It depicted two stick figures, clearly meant to be us, holding hands with a third, much taller, shadowy figure that had hollow eyes. We didn't have kids, and neither of us had ever seen the drawing before. A few days later, a small, antique silver locket appeared on Maya's nightstand. It wasn't hers. Inside was a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with a strangely familiar, sorrowful expression. The cold spots became almost unbearable, lingering for longer, feeling like invisible presences hovering just out of sight. We started hearing faint sounds, the rustle of clothing, a soft sigh, the distinct creak of the floorboards in the empty hallway, always just at the periphery of our hearing. Our sleep became restless, filled with vivid, disturbing dreams of being watched, of hushed voices whispering our names in the darkness. One evening, as I was alone in the loft, the ghost app on my phone suddenly screamed a series of frantic, overlapping words. Look, look, upstairs, watch. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the phone, then slowly turned my head towards the staircase leading to Maya's bedroom. Standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the dim light, was a tall, gaunt figure. It was indistinct, a wavering shadow, but its presence was undeniable, and its head was tilted, as if it were observing me. The climax arrived during a desperate attempt to ignore the escalating terror. We had decided to host a small gathering, hoping the presence of friends would somehow dispel the creeping dread. But as the evening progressed, the paranormal activity only intensified. The lights flickered erratically, the air grew inexplicably cold, and the ghost app on my phone, which I had tried to ignore, began to blare out frantic, overlapping words: danger, leave, get out, audible to everyone in the room. Suddenly, the ancient antique grandfather clock in the living room, which hadn't worked in years, began to chime, a slow, deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the very floor. As the final chime echoed, a piercing guttural scream erupted from the hallway, so loud and raw it made everyone jump. Then, a dark, amorphous shadow, far more substantial than anything we'd seen before, coalesced at the end of the hallway, directly in front of the door to Maya's bedroom. It pulsed with an internal, malevolent energy, and within its shifting form, to burning. Red pinpricks of light appeared, like eyes, fixated on us. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air grew thick with the metallic, acrid smell of old blood. The party dissolved into chaos. Guests screamed, scrambling for the door, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Maya and I, paralyzed by terror, could only watch as the shadow began to slowly, deliberately move towards us, its form growing larger, more defined, revealing a gaunt, elongated silhouette. I didn't wait. Maya and I grabbed each other's hands, letting out a primal scream, and bolted for the fire escape, leaving the terrifying entity and the echoing screams of the ghost app behind. We never went back to that loft, never retrieved our belongings, never even looked at another ghost app. Now, whenever a room suddenly chills, or I catch a fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision, I'm reminded of the time the ghost app stopped being a game, and something truly ancient and malevolent tried to claim us. The old farmhouse in rural Iowa had been a steal, a charming relic with sprawling fields and a quiet, peaceful air. But the peace quickly shattered when the objects started to move on their own, and the faint, melancholic singing began to drift from the empty nursery upstairs. My name is David, and I was a 35-year-old freelance writer, seeking solitude and inspiration away from the city bustle. I'd bought an old farmhouse, built in the late 1800s, just outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It was a beautiful, two-story house with a wraparound porch, surrounded by acres of cornfields and an endless sky. I spent my days renovating, gardening, and enjoying the quiet life. I was a practical man, a bit of a romantic for old architecture, but firmly grounded in the tangible world. I didn't believe in ghosts or haunted houses. I believed in history, in the echoes of lives lived, not in lingering spirits. The farmhouse felt old, yes, but also welcoming, a perfect sanctuary for a new chapter in my life. The first hint of something unusual was subtle, easily dismissed. I'd come downstairs in the morning to find kitchen cabinet doors ajar, or a book that I'd left on the coffee table moved to a different spot. I blamed my own forgetfulness, or perhaps the settling of the old house. Then, the distinct scent of pipe tobacco would sometimes waft through the living room. Always fleeting, always when no one else was around. It was a pleasant, old-fashioned smell, but it was perplexing. I'd search for the source, but find nothing. But then, the singing began, faint, melodic, and undeniably mournful. It seemed to drift from the second floor, specifically from the room I had designated as a guest bedroom, but which had clearly once been a nursery. It sounded like a woman's voice, singing a gentle, old-fashioned lullaby. I'd pause my work, strain my ears, but the moment I focused on it, the singing would stop. I assumed it was the wind, or perhaps a radio from a distant farm, though the remoteness of my location made that unlikely. One evening, as I was working late, my antique desk lamp, which was heavy, and stable, inexplicably toppled over, crashing to the floor. There was no draft, no bump. It just fell. The singing from the nursery became more frequent, more distinct. It wasn't just lullabies now, but sometimes fragmented phrases, spoken softly, like a mother cooing to a child. The tone was always one of profound sadness. The objects in the house became more actively restless. I'd find picture frames turned face down, small trinkets moved from shelves to the floor, and once, a set of old baby booties, which I'd stored away in a box in the attic, were found carefully placed on the rocking chair in the nursery. My blood ran cold. I started closing all the doors in the house when I went to bed, only to wake up and find them all wide open. The pipe tobacco smell intensified, often accompanied by the distinct scent of baby powder, a poignant and unsettling combination. I tried to research the farmhouse's history. I found old newspaper clippings detailing a tragic past. A young couple in the early 1900s, losing their infant child to a sudden illness, and the mother later dying of grief. The nursery, I realized, with a sickening dread, was where it had all happened. The temperature in the house became erratic, with sudden, icy cold spots appearing in the nursery and the master bedroom, often accompanied by a feeling of being watched. One night I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard the distinct sound of someone softly crying, coming from the empty side of my bed. It was a woman's sob, quiet and heartbroken, so close I could almost feel a breath on my ear. I froze, too terrified to move, to even breathe, until the sobbing slowly faded into silence. The climax arrived on a particularly dark and stormy night. The wind howled through the fields, rattling the old windows, and the rain lashed against the house. I was in the living room, trying to calm my racing heart, when I heard the mournful singing from the nursery intensify, becoming a wailing lament filled with an unbearable anguish. The objects in the living room began to move violently. Books flew off shelves, lamps toppled, and a heavy armchair spun slowly on its own. The air grew impossibly cold, and the smell of pipe tobacco and baby powder became overwhelming. Then, the antique music box that sat on the mantelpiece, a delicate, ceramic piece that hadn't worked in years, suddenly sprang to life, playing a distorted, tinny lullaby. As its melody filled the room, the shadowy form of a woman, translucent and weeping, began to coalesce at the foot of the main staircase. Her form was indistinct, wavering like smoke, but her grief was palpable, radiating through the entire house. She slowly extended a shimmering, insubstantial arm towards me, her mouth opening in a silent, agonizing scream, her gaze fixed on something unseen beyond me. Then, from the nursery upstairs, a baby's piercing cry echoed through the house. So loud and realistic it seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I sprang from the couch, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and ran for the front door, leaving the wailing spirit, the flying objects, and the terrifying baby's cry behind me. I burst out into the stormy night, not looking back at the farmhouse that was no longer a sanctuary, but a tomb of lingering grief. I drove until dawn, until the fields of Iowa were far behind me. I never returned to that farmhouse, selling it sight unseen to the first interested buyer. Now, whenever I hear a distant lullaby, or the faint scent of pipe tobacco, or the unexpected creak of an old floorboard, I'm reminded of the other residents of that farmhouse, forever trapped in their sorrow, forever reaching for what they lost. The new job as a caretaker for the historic Blackwood Manor seemed like a dream, a grand old estate in upstate New York, rich with history. But the dreams quickly turned to nightmares when the figures in the antique paintings began to move, and the faint, discordant music started to drift from the locked ballroom. My name is Robert, and I was a 40-year-old history buff and aspiring restorer, eager to escape the city and immerse myself in a project. The Blackwood Manor, nestled in the Catskill Mountains, was a sprawling, opulent estate built in the late 1700s, with intricate woodwork, vast libraries, and a profound sense of forgotten grandeur. It had been left vacant for decades, a true fixer-upper, and my job was to oversee its initial preservation and security. I considered myself a logical, detail-oriented individual, fascinated by the past, but firmly rooted in the present. I didn't believe in ghosts. I believed in architectural integrity and historical facts. The manor, with its peeling wallpaper and dusty chandeliers, felt like a sleeping beauty waiting to be awakened. A challenging but rewarding endeavor. The first hint of something unusual was the eyes. I'd be meticulously cleaning an antique portrait of a severe-looking man in colonial attire, or a stern woman in a velvet gown, and feel an unsettling sensation that their painted eyes were following my movements. I'd chuckle, attributing it to the aging paint or the trick of light in the dim rooms. But then, as I'd walk away and glance back, I'd swear the expression on a portrait's face had subtly shifted, a flicker of sorrow or disapproval. Then, the music began, faint, discordant strains of an old waltz. A melancholic melody played on a piano, drifting from the locked ballroom on the ground floor. I'd checked the room, convinced I'd left a radio on. But the ballroom was always empty, its grand piano covered in a thick sheet, silent and still. I blamed drafts, or perhaps a neighbor's faint music, carrying on the wind, though the manor was miles from any other dwelling. One afternoon, I found a small, antique silver thimble resting on the massive, dust-covered dining table. It wasn't mine, and I had no idea where it could have come from. It felt strangely warm to the touch. The music from the ballroom became more frequent, sometimes accompanied by the faint, rhythmic swish-wish-wish of invisible fabric, like ballroom dancers gliding across the floor. The waltz would transition into other old melodies, some cheerful, some hauntingly sad. The figures in the paintings became overtly restless. I'd walk into a room to find a portrait slightly askew, or an entirely different portrait hanging in a spot where I had been certain another one previously hung. The expressions on their faces became more pronounced, showing distinct anger, sadness, or a chilling, blank stare. I started to notice small, anachronistic details appearing in rooms: a single, withered rose placed on a dusty vanity, a delicate porcelain teacup filled with stale, brown liquid on a bedside table in an empty bedroom. I tried to research the Blackwood family, digging through old records and local archives. I uncovered a history fraught with tragedy, sudden deaths, unexplained disappearances, and a recurring theme of profound, unfulfilled longing. The manor, I realized with a growing dread, was a repository of lingering emotions. The temperature in the house became highly erratic, with intense cold spots appearing in unexpected places, often accompanied by the faint scent of old perfume or wood smoke. One night, as I was sitting in the library, illuminated only by a single lamp, I heard a distinct, heavy thump from the room directly above me, the master bedroom. It sounded like something large had fallen. I grabbed my flashlight, my heart hammering against my ribs, and cautiously ascended the grand staircase. The climax arrived during a desperate, late-night patrol. The music from the ballroom was a chaotic symphony of discordant notes, a terrifying cacophony of violins and piano, filling the entire ground floor. The figures in the portraits were no longer merely shifting. They were subtly moving within their frames, their painted eyes following me with chilling intensity, their expressions contorted in anguish and silent screams. I was in the main gallery, surrounded by dozens of ancient paintings, when the temperature plummeted to an unbearable cold. The very air seemed to crackle with an unseen energy. Then, one of the largest portraits, depicting the manor's founder, a stern, imposing man, slowly began to breathe. His chest subtly rose and fell, his painted eyes, now glowing with a faint, internal light, fixed on mine. His lips, painted on the canvas, slowly, painstakingly, parted, and a low, raspy whisper, filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow, echoed through the gallery. "She waits in the ballroom." As his voice faded, the grand, heavy double doors to the ballroom, which I had kept securely locked, slowly, deliberately, swung open with a resounding creak, revealing a swirling mist of cold, white vapor within, and from that mist, the faint, shimmering silhouette of a woman, dressed in a faded ball gown, slowly emerged, her head tilted, beckoning me into the darkness. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I dropped my flashlight, sending it clattering across the marble floor, and sprinted for the nearest exit, leaving the breathing portraits, the cacophony of ghostly music, and the beckoning figure in the ballroom behind me. I burst out into the cold night, not looking back at the manor that was no longer a dream, but a living nightmare. I never returned to Blackwood Manor, resigning immediately and never looking back. Now, whenever I see an old painting with piercing eyes, or hear a faint, distant melody, I'm reminded of the other inhabitants of Blackwood Manor, forever trapped in their grand, haunted halls, forever waiting for someone to join their dance.